ignore that for now. Thank you to the students for coming. I know it's always a bit hard to show up in person to class, so I appreciate it, guys. And for those of you online, thank you for joining us to this CEF Group webinar. So today it's my pleasure to introduce the founder, director and portfolio manager of Tahito Funds, Temuera Hall, who has had a lengthy career in management and governance of iwi entities and has now moved into the portfolio management space, looking at investing with a te ao Maori worldview. So without further ado, please welcome Temuera.
Au tēnā nō koutou, me tīmata pēnei. Kimi he te akamatua kia wheterere ake ko te kaua e runga, ko te kaua e raro. Kia tā whia, kia tā maua, kia ita i roto i arua, i te pūkenga i arua, i te hora i arua, i te wana i arua, matua take o tāne. Para mai koutou ki ari o tā ringa ki te whakarongo. Ko ngā tā ringa o rongo mai tahanui o rongo mai taharangi o tūpai whakarongo wānanga. Ko te kaua o Tahito ko tēnei. Manahua te tapu o Tahito ki, Tahito kōro, Tahito wānanga. Manahua te tapu o Tahito ngāwari, Tahito hau, Tahito mārangaranga. Mā te whakakotahi i te mātauranga take, me ngā mōhi o tango te ao huri ka hura mai te hena tore. Kia ao mai te māramatanga. Mā ngā whakatauiratanga o te ao Tahito e rari ai ngā hua e manako he i te ao tūroa. Mā te tūhono kia rangi, kia papa, ki ngā atua katoa, e whita mai ai te ahi o te ao take. So what that intro talks about is first transcending the physical. Kauai runga is upper jaw, kauai raro is your lower jaw that moves. A very simple concept of kaupapa, your main subject, and then your tikanga on how you go about achieving that. Of course, that's a lower jaw, and you need both jaws to survive. That's how simple that philosophy is. Then we talk about the combining of indigenous knowledge with current technologies and systems so we can uncover the wisdom that shines within. Now, if I'm looking down, it's because my paper has got more intelligence than my brain, and I'm reading the notes because I spent a bit of time writing these up. But by raising our ancestral knowledge, we can increase our aspiration of balance and harmony. And by connecting to our ancestors of sky and earth and all of nature's qualities, we believe we can reignite regenerative behaviours. So to draw a conclusion up front, we're in a desperate need for culture and behaviour change. And you guys being the vanguard in this space, you know, there's not many students that have come through studying in this specific space of sustainability and what's required to deal with our global challenges. What's needed is transformational leaders to deal with the challenges that we are facing. We're firstly going to jump into Te Ao Māori, and we're going to go pretty deep. Feel free to stop and ask questions, and don't be shy. But the Māori worldview is captured in whakapapa essentially, but it's relational and interconnected. What we're talking about today is our Indigenous contribution to a new global story of sustainability, diversity, and equity. And in my view, those are the challenges we actually have to deal with. It's not climate change, it's not biodiversity loss, it's not ocean acidification. If we deal with equity and diversity, we'll be able to solve a lot of those problems, and we'll talk more on that. So we call our Māori worldview collective self-intelligence. Everything is interrelated, nothing exists of itself. Now, to go a little bit further, we got to look into this thing called Maori and aroha. Maori o te ora, aroha, ora o te aroha, Maori ora. Have you heard of those words? You heard of Maori and aroha? Okay, so then Maori is your sort of life's essence, your essential being. And then aroha is another version you probably haven't heard, is connection. It's compassion, it's love, but to have that compassion and that love with someone, you have to be connected with them. The background word for aroha is kia aro te ha, which literally means to be close enough to feel that person's breath. So if you're that close, you're either in love or you're having a fight. So what we're talking about here is if you increase that connection to something, there's more likelihood that you're going to care about that person or that thing. And in this case, we're talking about reconnecting to the environment. And if you increase that connection, you will then increase the Maori. So effectively what we do at Tahito is we're measuring aroha connection. Double-sided. Right, as I've mentioned already, our traditional knowledge is captured in whakapapa, a form of genealogy. Now, I don't know how much, have you heard, who knows, who can connect to their great-grandparents? Who goes back further? We just watched the Queen and that event, and they go back a few thousand years. Māori whakapapa goes back that far. It connects us to our extended family. So when you're born into that world, your second, third, and fourth cousins are as close to you as your first cousins. After that, we connect to our sub-tribe, our hapu, and then we connect to our iwi, then we connect to neighboring tribes. And then we connect to our origins. Then you start getting into the space which is lesser known, which is connecting to everything in the environment, and then connecting to your emotions. And then it also maps our creation narrative. I'm going to share some of this with you. And the reason why I'm sort of brave enough to share this now is we're going through an interesting time in New Zealand where we're starting to embrace Māori culture. And for that to progress, we have to start sharing more. And so that you can understand what sits behind some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today in particular, but what sits behind the thinking, the values, the behaviors. So there's the Māori creation whakapapa. Effectively, you can summarize this down, and you'll hear this often. Mai te kore, ki te pō, ki te whai ao, ki te ao marama. From the void of nothingness, through the darkness, into the glimmering light, and into the world of light. So one thing our ancestors did really well is to summarize a whole lot of stuff down to something nice and simple, so that it can be taught and carried on at a general level, and then the detailed stuff was reserved for the traditional wānanga. So you can see this ends with Ranginui and Papatūnuku. So you can't apply time and space to this though, so you can't think about it in human genealogy sense. But this just gives you an idea of this, and this is only one component of the creation whakapapa that brings us down to sky and earth. If you wanted to internalize this, this is going from the singularity to the duality. For those of you who are into spiritual stuff, you'll see that in a lot of other cultures, a lot of Eastern cultures, very strong, the yin yang type philosophies. Now, that stuff, you can find that on the wall at the Auckland University, the Auckland Museum. So what I'm showing you actually it's not hidden, it used to be. You can now Google the stuff and find it. Problem is it's without the context. Without the context, without the narrative, it's just names on a page. And it's life's work to really unlock the knowledge and the wisdom that's inside the genealogy. Who's heard of Tāne? Tāne of the forests, Tangaro of the oceans, Tāwhiri of the winds, right? There's all their brothers. There's 70 of them. These are the children of Rangi and Papa. These 70 children represent everything in nature and our emotions. Some of them, we call them atua or our ancestors because we descend from them. That's our that's the connectivity I'm talking about. So this is the biosphere. This is everything between space and then the center of Earth. That's required for life and for us to survive. So that was captured in this space. What's become common knowledge now is 7 of these. So there's a lot of unpacking to do here, but just to show you the depth of the understanding of how we connected with nature. And what's good now is we're starting to line up modern science with traditional Maori knowledge and see the parallels. Let's just keep going. You'll find this on Google if you really want to find it. But again, you won't have any context. You'd struggle to find context to it. Now we come into the human stuff. So for us, I'm from Tūwharetoa, we're Te Arawa Waka, and we're very closely aligned to the Tainui Waka. So a lot of this stuff is our tribal histories, our tribal knowledge. So in our case, we come down from Tūmatoenga and Hiniahone. And there it is. It's still before humans. Remember, we can't think humans yet. This is still our evolution from sky and earth through to humans, and how we then step out into this planet. And you see that comes in a tiki. Most of you have heard about the hei tiki. It's quite a common taonga. Well, that's what tiki represents, the first man. And got to emphasize, this is one set of whakapapa. There's quite a bit more. I'm just giving you something to riff off from, or to hopefully impress you to think that I know some stuff. And so this goes all the way down to tāwhaki. See tiki there now, we've got humans coming into the mix. So now we can start thinking in time and space and generations. Then just to finish that off, this is from tāwhaki down to Ngātoroirangi at number 15. So now we've arrived in New Zealand, in Aotearoa on the Te Arawa Waka. And then there's all the descendants from Ngātoroirangi through to Tūwharetoa. So that's our tipuna, our main ancestor. So that's our tribe, Ngāti Tūwharetoa. Tūwharetoa Te Aupōuri was his name. And so now we're migrating from the coast into Taupo and settling around Lake Taupo. And then there's another 16 or 17 to 20 generations, depending, not everyone works in 20-year, 25-year cycles. So another 20 odd generations down to us living today. Now you won't find that. You won't find the genealogy from there down to the individual. That's kept with, with the sub-tribes and with the families. And it gets quite diverse, of course. Now you're talking thousands of lines. But that's just a central line down to our tribe. Again, just to emphasize what sits behind Tahito, we're going to dive in a little bit into the rarohainga whakapapa, because this is where we derive our values and our ethics that we apply then to our investment decision-making process. The female creation narrative, it provides context on how we live our lives. It anchors the non-physical spiritual story as opposed to the male, which is more the physical, the seen world. And it's through the lessons we can reconnect back to our collective selves, back to our spiritual selves from our individual selves, of which we walk in every day. So the female story is known as the hidden story. So we look at this through what we call ngā ruahine, or our female ancestors. So to give you some examples of ngā ruahine, so I'll just read this bit out. So you had Hiniahone and Hinititama, her daughter. They disappear into this realm called rarohainga. So this is story stuff, right? They disappear into this realm called rarohainga and become hine ngaro, lost female. But the Māori word for brain is hine ngaro. So what it also does is it brings our intuition and those sort of senses into intellect, into knowledge, and into wisdom, all captured in the female whakapapa. That's what it talks to. But then it also captures our aroha connection behaviours that will lift Maori. And some couple of quick examples. You got manahua te tapu or apakura o te aroha. So that's talking about empowering love and compassion. You even got Hiniahone o te kura, which represents nature. and the knowledge of all things natural. And I've just showed you a whole page of children of rangi and papa, which connects to everything in nature. And then you got another example, mahuiko o te mauhi, which is empowering passion and desire. So that's just a quick flirt, I suppose, with our female ancestors. Now we're going to jump out of that esoteric space and just get back into some boring facts and figures. So the indigenous race, 6% of the total population, but we own and occupy a quarter of the world's surface. And we safeguard 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. The issue we have is a lot of those areas owned or occupied and controlled by Indigenous people is not recognised. The ownership's not recognised. Where in New Zealand it is, and we'll come on to that. Now, this has been a bit whakahihi, but Indigenous hold vital knowledge and expertise on how to adapt, mitigate, and reduce climate disaster risk. Those aren't my words. That's taken from reports from the United Nations, the World Bank, and the World Economic Forum. Any questions yet? We're going to come close to home now, come back to New Zealand. This is Maori land. We were lucky. We've got left 1.4 million hectares, or 5% of the total. You've probably seen all those little clips which shows over time history how we went from 100% to 5%. But when we look at our Maori land use today, there is 44% native cover. You can see the numbers against New Zealand total of 26.8 million hectares. And you can see there's 49% in native land cover, 40% in exotic grass and the likes, 1% urban areas. Now I point this out because our Māori land is 80% carbon positive. 3/4 of it, over 3/4 is carbon positive. It's never been negative on the environment or climate change, but there's no reward or recognition for that. So the question then is, why is it? Why has a lot more of our land been retained in its native state or in carbon positive? And this is when we start to get a bit challenging. You can argue that it's because we got left the less, the bad lands, hard to develop, in the hills and poor productivity. You can argue it's the lack of capacity, the lack of ability to manage and develop those lands. But I believe it's because of our cultural values and beliefs and behaviours. But here's some underlying facts, the stuff that sits on top of the land. Firstly, it's not a capital model. Catch up with myself. So the land and the assets are not for sale. So find an economic model that your core underlying asset, which you then generate your revenue from, cannot be sold. So that's one fundamental difference. It's collective ownership. There's no single or big shareholder, so the wealth doesn't go to a few. There is no such thing as a major shareholder in our large Māori land entities, our Māori entities, be it land or whatever the asset type is. There was actually no traditional understanding of ownership. That's something that's got introduced, and we've just had to learn how to live with. So the structures we have today are just a result of this concept of ownership. The core asset has never been, no one's paid for it. That's another key thing to remember, because that doesn't fit into capital models if you actually haven't bought it in the first place. So we call that taonga tuku iho. It's been bequeathed to us from our ancestors, and our job is to protect, care for that land and pass it on to the next generation. Again, struggle, we'll get into what that means against capital models. And then we value the collective over the individual. So we talk natural groupings of whānau, hapu, and iwi, instead of how much do I get out of this. But you've got to remember, we've all been raised in this, we've all been raised in the Western world. So even I have to play in that space. So I'm talking about the fundamentals and the ideals. You can easily pull this apart. But what is fairly undeniable is the deep embedded connection to the environment, and I've shown you some whakapapa around that. Then we have these other things, these other intangible things called aroha, mauri, and wairua, and we've touched on that. So the two predominant economic systems today are capitalism and socialism. Between these two opposite extremes lies a continuum of variations of models, or various models. Three key principles define the economic system of capitalism. That's private ownership, production, distribution of goods and services. Now, you know, if you're an academia, you probably can dig a lot deeper into capitalism than I ever care to. But those models in between are called mixed economy models. They're the most common forms today, and you'll see them in the large, more developed countries. That's US, UK, all of Europe, and of course, Australia and New Zealand. Now, Te Ao Māori doesn't fit within that capitalism model. I went to another university of Auckland just the other week, and the purpose of us coming, there was industry players and some of academia, they want to develop a faculty called inclusive capitalism. And then they wanted Te Ao Māori to be part of that. And I said, well, you can't actually put Te Ao Māori inside inclusive capitalism, but it can be a lens to look through to understand capitalism and its issues. And we're going to touch on this. You're getting this for the first time, because that's the one before that I went to was around natural capital. So I've had all these couple of sort of workshop seminars trying to develop these things to feed into my thinking to then create this presentation, which is specifically for you guys, because Sebastian asked. So digging a bit more into capitalism, its core motive is making profit. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's opportunities for and benefits. They include providing wealth, innovation, improving the lives of individuals, and giving power to people. But its core motivation is profit, and then you either apply that profit to grow the business or to reward the investors. It's competitive, and then you rely on supply and demand in the free market to then govern the price. But that's pushing out to neoliberalism, and if that gets out of control and the government don't put regulations around that, you can get the energy crisis like we're seeing up in Europe, where there isn't control, and now they're on the back foot trying to cover their power supply for the winter. You know, it's quite scary what's going on in that part of the world right now. But the other side is they generally have little regard. When you're pushing for profit, you've got little regard for social and their social environmental impact. But you probably know this stuff already. This is your course. So the downsides, of course, excessive greed and the formation of monopolies leading to gross inequity, exploitation leading to biodiversity loss, rising temperatures, poor welfare, and poverty. So that's the other side of capitalism. But capitalism itself isn't the problem. It's a human behavior. It's a structure that we've developed. So the problem is actually human behavior. So I've created this word Māoriism so that we can look at and make some other comparisons. So of course, arguably, capitalism is underpinned by individualism. So that's where your laws are about the rights of each person, your independence, personal protection, your personal identity. The other extreme of that, I mean, this is academic stuff, right? But these are the two core systems that apply in underlining all of the politics, decision-making, and the societal structures. So collectivism at the other extreme, that's puts community high in its importance. Unity and selflessness are its core traits. So now we're getting pretty close to how the Māori society, arguably the Māori, traditional Māori society, we fit into the socialist collective type, but it's still not quite enough. We've talked about whakapapa. We've talked about the relational interdependence. What we haven't talked about yet is the fact that in the Māori world, people are not in the centre. It's not a human-centric model where those other models are. So, remaining on more of the provocative side, here's our Western problem. We think we own nature. We have our deed in our title, which gives us power and control. But just let you in on a little secret, Papa Tuanuku, Earth, doesn't care about our ownership, and actually doesn't care whether we are here or not as humans. So we have this whakatauki called mate ai te tangata toi tū te whenua, which literally means people die and the land remains. You know, we're good for 70, 80, maybe 90 years, 100 years if you're really good, and what did the Queen do, 96? So our whole thinking, and you've heard this before, whole thinking sort of operates in our whole education, all our systems operate in a single generation. That's the problem of the Western model. I come across this guy, Gus Spence. He's the founder of Natural Resource Defence Council, NGO out of New York, millions of dollars of revenue, which they apply to good stuff. And he's obviously a scientist. And his quote was, I thought 30 years of good science could address the problems of biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse and climate change. But he says he was wrong, and that the top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. So as soon as people start talking like this, you're going, right, you're coming close to the Maori world when you start talking about a spiritual and cultural change. And hence that's where we started as our conclusion. And he's saying scientists don't know how to do that. So we'll just transition again. Because what we're saying is our indigenous models can be a solution to the challenges. They can teach us to see the world through a different lens. As I said before, where people are not the centre. And we're in a good space. You know, New Zealand is really starting to, as a country, we're really starting to embrace our cultures. And the more we do that, the more we can create this New Zealand Inc., Aotearoa Inc. Systems and processes and transformation to be able to deal with these challenges that we face. So let's have a look at what we're facing. GDP, you're familiar with that term? Should be if you're in this class in the finance school and the business school, gross domestic product. Okay, come about in, yeah, I've got it down here. I can't pronounce the fellow's name, that's Simon, I'll just say Simon K so I don't bastardize his name. But he, American economist, developed in 1934, and it was adopted as the main measure of a country's economy in 1944. So we've got about 70 years of history since GDP became the main measure of economic growth. And this is what we're faced with. This is your global risk report that the World Economic Forum produce every year. You see there that in the top 10 risks, 5 of them are environmental, 3 of them are societal. Now this stuff, if you've seen it in your news feeds, and we're seeing it out our window. It's actually transpiring right now. My wife's the trade commissioner in Taiwan, so I've been bouncing back between Taiwan and Aotearoa, and I was up there when the Chinese decided to surround the island and fire missiles over the top. Now that's an example of this stuff breaking down. Or just playing out, really. Then it gets backed up by this. You've seen these donut models, which talks about the tipping points by Kate Raworth. If you haven't, oh good, you've seen this stuff. Well, you have a look at that graph. We're hitting 6s. For those that are not cricket players, a 6 is when you hit over the boundary. And what this graph shows us is where past tipping points, arguably, for climate change, biodiversity loss, nitrogen and phosphate. And there's 2 that they haven't created a boundary for, but you can pretty much add them in, and that's ocean acidification and freshwater withdrawal. So it doesn't look good, but you guys know that. That's why you're in this course. But let's put this in real plain English. We're exhausting the planet. The inputs required to maintain economic outputs are unsustainable. GDP and capital supply and demand measures are broken. Now, what I mean there is if you're taking fossil fuel or coal or mining and you're considering that as economic growth, well then it's wrong, because the negative impact of those activities are worse than the positive growth measure, right? So this is where you get into measuring your externalities and true cost accounting. So that's broken, has to change. You fellas should know that already. Sebastian should have already told you that. Then when you get into capital supply and demand and the quality of capital, if you're receiving capital from manufacturing of sources which are damaging the environment, damaging communities, well then that's criminal. And if you're then applying that capital towards negative sources, negative industries, well then that should be called criminal capital and you should be charged accordingly. This is where this is what this is all moving to. But it takes a big shift to change the ship that we're on. So what are the solutions? We'll change our behaviors. That's what we're saying. Change how we, and you've heard all this, change how we live, have more plant-based diets, relate to each other better. That's the diversity piece. Circular economy principles, you should know all about that. And then true cost accounting, measuring your externalities. And then ultimately it's just about reducing our footprint, doing more with less. So what's happened? What are we doing globally? Well, we got the SDGs adopted by UN members, produced by the UN and adopted by members in September 2015, and they're all good. They identify all the problems and puts us on a path to address them. And then what's happened since then is the sustainability revolution, and you're all part of it. This whole new industry has come up. And you can see them there. Yeah, these are all the words. A lot of this is new stuff. I was quizzing Sebastian on the way in to make sure I didn't look out of place here. And when did this course start? When did the Climate and Energy Foundation start? They've all been after 2015. So there's a whole business going on now, and you will feed into this. This will be your industry if you carry on in this space. Then the reformed capital models, and I said I've been to natural capital, inclusive capital. And it's all good stuff. I'm not saying it's bad, because this is important. We need to be making these shifts. So you got the 5 capitals and the 12 features of sustainable society. And what they talk about there is society, communities at large, finding positive values and a sense of purpose collectively. Then you got this, the UN environmental programs, the 6 sectors of solution. You see the energy, industry, food, nature, transport, buildings and cities. And they're defining pathways on how we get to our climate change goals to try and keep the planet under the 1.5% temperature increase, of which we're over already, of course, you know that. Now let's dig deeper. Let's dig under the hood. This is the behavior stuff that sits within our capital models. So there's the global wealth. 12% of the global population own 85% of the wealth. And if that's not enough, 80% of the public markets are owned by institutions. These 3 are the largest ones. 1.12 trillion value of assets under management worldwide. And you see there BlackRock, if you haven't heard of them, this all now government was up in the States not too long ago. They went and visited BlackRock, Vanguard, Charles Schwab, very common names in the investment finance sector. So you want to fix the problem? There's 80% of it for the public markets at least. Turn those people and the job's done. Turn the 12.2% and we've fixed the problem. But when this is my bugbear, as I said earlier, we need to deal with inequity. We need to deal with diversity. And this is a shift since 1950 to current. And you can see back then from the median wage, and I've used the US median here in current times at 34.6 thousand. You can see it was 20 times between the average set wage and the CEO, average CEO, not the top, just the average, was 20 times in 1950. And you can see now, just with the S&P 500, 2021, it's 324 times. So that's the problem. We've all only got 24 hours in a day. You're talking about, you're buying a person's time with a salary. You're buying their time and their experience. So this is telling us that one person's time and experience is worth 324 more times than the average person. Now, you'll find this, I haven't made this up. This is, you go searching for the stuff and this is what you get given around the capital wealth model. So essentially, when we look at the world we're in today, there's 1% that own the capital. Then there's 10% that grow, manage, protect the capital. That's us. That's the space I'm in. That's the space you'll be in once you graduate and get out to the workforce. You'll be in that management space. You might, if you're lucky, get up to the 1%. The 1% is when you're earning $1 million of revenue a year, pretty much. Then you got the 88%, 7 billion of the 8 billion people in the world, they work for the 1%. They're all the wage workers sweating the assets. You got some small business owners and all that, they're all in that space. So that's what the world actually looks like when you contextualize it or illustrate it from a capital model. Then you got this other 1%, and that's again, I don't exactly know what that number is. It could be more. These are the people living outside the capital system or living on the edge of it. So those, you know, all those indigenous people in the rainforests in South Africa, you know, some of the tribes in Africa, some of the villages and tribes even across the Pacific on the remote islands. And then you could arguably go to Northland, and then you could go over to Takaka. There's a lot of people there living outside, off the grid, outside the system, by choice. Others are there because that's just been their system, sustainability type subsistence living. So we're going to come out of that now. Got to catch up with myself. Here's a quote from this famous fellow, Albert Einstein. And what he's saying is, we cannot solve our problems. You've heard the one, you know, that doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome as a version of insanity. Well, here's another one of his, which is a bit more pertinent, and that is, we cannot solve the problems with the same thinking we use to create them. So my argument here is redefining capital and just working within capital models to try and fix the problem is a definition of what he's saying. We're not going to be able to fix the problem. It's not enough. And then just the other day, the Secretary General of the United Nations, you know, they're trying to be provocative, these people. They're trying to make a statement and get recognized, but they're also got to be, you know, when you're in those positions of leadership, it's got to be based off some fact, and it's got to be based off of some real information and knowledge that supports it. And he's saying we're facing global dysfunction and we're in a splintered world. And of course, he's referring to the war in Ukraine, the massive floods in Pakistan, the droughts in China, the China-Taiwan conflict, the Iran pressures in Iran, the Palestinian efforts. You know, this, he's saying we've gone back, we're going back into fortress block type behaviors, and we're still suffering from the logistics, being able to get supply. If you want to go and order the latest Ford Ranger, you're going to have to wait 3 or 4 months. That's never been the case. You know, that's or even half a year. So this is what we're facing. They're all symptoms of the current global state. Just a couple of more whakatauki. We've talked about that whatu ngarongaro te tangata is another version. And then e kore au ngaro he kākano I rui i mai rangi ātia. That's quite common. But what that's telling us is that as a human, I don't have to worry about my physical presence because this is where I come from. I come from the greater collective consciousness, or the greater spiritual oneness. So that way we can get outside of our singularity, our human existence, and step outside and look at the world from a different lens. This is what our government is doing. We've got the living standards, and they've just upgraded it to the 4 capitals. So it's actually 5, because you see one of them is finance and physical capitals. And that's as they're trying to answer the question to social demographic inequities and well-being. So we're putting some good effort in this country. But here's a Maori model. So I'm part of a group called Ngā Pukenga. We sit alongside Treasury, and we've developed the Heara Waiora model. And you can see it doesn't talk about capitals. It's a holistic socio-ecological system. We've got Wairu in the centre, but don't get confused by that, because Wairu often gets transferred into meaning just spirituality, which then you'll get lost in religion. It's bigger than that. But then it has the environment and then the human domain. So Treasury are on a journey now to apply this, and it has been applied. It got applied this year in budget setting, into policy and decision making around how they set the budget. So all the departments, when they apply for their funds, they now have to consider the Heara Waiora model alongside the living standards model. So we're doing some good stuff in this country. So let's quote these fellas: Carl Hendrik, Robert, and Peter Senge. Have you heard of them? Heard of these people? Worth writing their names down and looking them up. Get some little TED Talks or speeches by them. They're great. These are transformational leaders, these guys. And because what we're saying is, in order to achieve this impactful social and economic purpose, you first need leadership with the right belief, compassion, and behaviours. Leaders with a high level of compassion and selflessness. Leaders who believe that to create equity, environmental stability, and regeneration, we need to avoid further concentration of wealth and wealth polarisation. Transformational leaders that strive for a quantum shift in economics, prioritising the environment and the well-being of communities. Leaders committed to a new story on how we want the world to be. These guys talk to this stuff. So Carl saying the question of reaching sustainability is not about whether we have the money or the resources or the technology. It's about having the transformational leaders to be able to achieve it. And then Peter Senge even gets deeper still and gets very close to our Maori worldview. When all said and done, the only change that will make a difference is the transformation of the human heart. So if you're getting these leaders, people listen to these people. They don't get, people don't shut off. They're renowned in their fields. So the message is out there in a handful. It's how do we get that down into the ones that need to know this stuff, and they can really drive that change, because they're not running BlackRock. These guys aren't running the big Apples and the Amazons. The big multinationals. How are we going for time? 12:45. Well, we're jumping now into our space. This is these are our tahito values, and as we said earlier, they've been derived from the ruahine, or the rarohanga type whakapapa, and you can see them there. We've synthesized them down to 9 different values, and they talk just the English one-word translations, which don't do it justice, but for the purpose of presentation, you can see it's about balance, it's complementary, it's reciprocity. As I said, it's a holistic socio-ecological system, and trying to find the best English description of what we do. To apply this knowledge, it's not rocket science. As I said before, it's just putting the environment for people, people before profit, and putting the collective before the individual. But that speaks volumes. Find people that actually do this as your challenge. What we're effectively doing is measuring, as I said, we're measuring aroha connection. It's measuring behaviour change. So our system is measuring the move from your individual worldview, which, to be fair, now we look at all companies across. We've developed a fund called, it's called the Tai o Rehua, which literally is the Maori name for the Trans-Tasman Sea. It's an Australasian equities fund. The reason why we're in Australasian equities is because the shop I partnered with to do this, it's called the ISG Group. They look after over 6 billion in funds. So it's a good boutique New Zealand financial services company. It's a group of companies. And so having looked at Australasian equities now for a number of years, our fund is 3 years old. We started this 2 years before that, doing the research and development. Very few companies sit on that left-hand side anymore on this individual world. Most have moved. You can't survive in that space anymore. But that's your substantive independent. It's internally focused, and it's really just about profit and nothing else. And as you know, the world's moved on. Everything's pushes you out. We've just then developed a measure that goes right to the other extreme of that, which is that holistic worldview, and that's what our values represent. So it's a, I better read this properly so it sounds good. Effectively, we've developed our own taxonomy. So it's our own measuring system. There's over 60 measures. It's a positive scoring system. We integrate ESG on a values basis. Does that make sense? On a values basis, have you learned about the different forms of using ESG and the fact that ESG is really only a risk measure? You can find AAA companies with AAA rating that you wouldn't touch or barge pole if you're against fossil fuels. So it's important to understand ESG is just a risk measure. It's how you use it. It's the ethics and sustainability values that you bring to the table that makes the difference. So when we say, because you can just use it as risk, you could use it to try and outperform, or you can use it on a values basis. So we integrate on a values basis. It's a key point of difference. Positive scoring system, you've heard of that, as opposed to negative. Now, negative is when you just screen out fossil fuels, you screen out tobacco, you screen out gambling. That's a negative system. That's easy to do. It's a lot harder to do a positive system because now you've got to do a lot more research, and you look for good, and then at the end of it, you sum it all up and go, who are the best across a whole heap of space. But there's also, and you also put in negative screens because it just helps to get your universe down. So we've just downloaded or integrated our next level of values. So I showed you those 9 back there, which are pretty comprehensive, because with them, the way we transform that from sort of esoteric really into applied is we have to describe what that value means in its best English against our Maori sensibilities. Then we have to translate it again into a business concept so that it can be applied to measurements. So there's a 3-staged process. So that was our first layer. And then because the world keeps changing on us and we have to continually redefine our process so we fit into a box, because there's no box for Indigenous, ethical or sustainable investing, but there is for responsible investing, there is for sustainable themes, and there is this new one called impact. So now if we want to get impact accreditation, we have to then rewrite what we do in impact language. So it's almost been every year having to rewrite what we do without changing actually what we do, but just rewrite it so that the people who are the accreditors of the space, so we can get ticked as a responsible fund or impact fund, we then have to write it into the language that they want to hear. And sometimes it starts to get to a square peg, round hole type situation, which we're sort of starting to find with impact. But we've got to keep playing the game if we want to be competitive in the fund space. And so, by disclosure, we're no different from all the others. You know, we're just like having the electric car on the lot as opposed to the petrol car. But I think what we're driving towards is the point of difference. So now we just drop down these ethics of care. I won't bore you with them because you'll get the presentation if you want. But now we're into, you know, caring for the families and their well-being, caring for the planet. The ones that make a difference, of course, is Te Ao Tukupu down the bottom there, caring for collective self-universe. Now, these are some of these measures are quantitative. We can find data. A lot of them are qualitative, and it comes down to not just the lens, but the person looking through the lens that makes a difference. So you have to sort of grown up with this real, not necessarily Maori, but a real compassionate, empathetic, understanding. Selflessness is probably one of the key requirements. So again, to meet impact targets and create our intentionality, you heard those words now, that's impact. You have to have an intention to what you do. So we've had to develop an intentionality statement and an impact investment statement, and then redefine what we're actually measuring. So that's them there. We've got the pai o ranginui. So we're looking for companies that are zero carbon, zero contaminants into the atmosphere. Now, a lot of companies are already there, and all of them are on their journey. You have to be. You know, there's legislation now that says you have to be. The ultimate is that you meet all these. No one's meeting all these yet. We're probably a good 5 to 10 years away before anyone will get there in our universe that we look at. But I know they do exist. They do exist globally, because when you get into you know, the zero waste, zero fossil fuels, some industries are better than others. But you get into this te hapori whānui, or the mana taurite one, the race and gender. So you see they'll put a 1 to 10 age ratio. No listed company across Australasia is anywhere near that. But I know of global companies that are. So it's not unattainable. And so it's not a pipe dream. You know, it is possible. And hopefully when people wake up, they will reform their businesses along these lines and start that transition. Then we've got to hope it's a soft landing. You know, have you heard those terms in market terms? Soft landing as opposed to a hard landing. Hard landing is the world falls apart before we fix it. Soft landing is we bring it down gently without having a World War III or something to that effect. Because remember, we've got a history of wars, eh? Humans. It's been a long time since we've had a big war, probably the longest time in history. So problem is now with nuclear weapons, we don't want to think about the potential, and yet if you read the news feeds I read, you get Putin talking about that sort of stuff. Anyway, I'm digressing. The key thing here, you've got this Ngākau Aroha, the 5 and 6. This is the stuff we won't get RIA and the other agencies to understand, because we fit outside their box now when we talk about measuring selflessness and compassion. Well, we've got tools that do that. Then this other one is Maori Oho, that life force of immense value is its literal translation. So now we're talking about physical, metaphysical, race, harmony and balance. Now, unheard of language in the finance world, but I've just quoted other leaders, transformational leaders saying the same stuff. There's our process diagram. As we said, the first 3 stages, there's no financials in there. It's integrated with ESG. We start with the environmental ethics and sustainability measures. We then move into the social government measures, then the harder piece. That gets us down across our universe of, you know, the investable market index using the MSCI. We use the MSCI ESG system. As I said, technology is a big enabler. We'll get down to about 70 companies, and then the hard work starts, because it's very manual, the research in the 3rd stage. Again, it's a lot of qualitative judgment, and then we'll come down to about 40 to 50 companies, which will start developing a portfolio, and that's when we've got our valuation metrics with our portfolio asset allocation modelling and the risk modelling and everything that carries on there, and then our peer group reviews, and then our investment committees and our boards, and you know, all the policies that we have to meet, so that we can write a PDF that meets the FMA requirements, all those sorts of things. These are our negative screens. Where we probably differ from most is it's a lot longer than what most people have. and it's absolute. We don't have if it's under 5% revenues from fossil fuels, that's okay. If it's under 10% revenues from alcohol, that's okay, sort of thing. Ours is absolute. So that makes a higher bar, and that's because we're representing our, these Indigenous values. That's our ancestral knowledge. I've got no policeman sitting over me telling me that's right or wrong. So we'll just rise to the highest bar until we do develop that sort of attestation piece within the use of traditional Māori knowledge. Here's looking into our funders. So through the MSCI system, you can drop in the portfolio and get your carbon emissions. You can see there, the light blue line is AA or AAA rated ESG companies. And then the darker blue line is the investable markets. So you can see we're far lower as far as carbon goes by the 3 measures they got there. I won't bore you with the different, but you're familiar with scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. Yeah. And then, as we said, no fossil fuels, no fossil fuel ties or fossil fuel reserves. Of course, people are going to be driving cars and those sorts of things, but we're talking about the business that we're investing in, that they are not involved in fossil fuels. So that means the likes of Fonterra. We just had to kick Mercury out the other day because they went and brought the retail arm of Trust Power, now called Manawa, and they sell gas. So Mercury was a great company till then. Then we thought, well, geez, maybe we can pull in Trust Power, bring Manawa into the portfolio, but they've got an oil peaking station up north that they use to cover their load. Genesis has to hold coal to cover our electricity needs should we run short. So there's not a lot of our utilities that are actually meet the no fossil fuel requirement that we have. There's some other measures. Mindful Money, you may have heard of them. They issue some badges to certification that you're fossil fuel free and for weapons free. We got to run through the Morningstar system. We get 5 globes. That's about as good as you can get by Morningstar measurements. It's early days, because we're only 3 years of data, and then on their system, it's from when you come on, so really only 1 year of data with Morningstar. So we can't really sing from the rooftops yet. And then when we compare ourselves just by ESG measures, you can see the portfolio gets a AAA rating. But as I said, that's meaningless unless you understand the detail underneath. And when we set out, we thought, well, geez, if we can just match the benchmark, we're doing good. And our benchmark isn't any special benchmark because there isn't one yet. There isn't a sustainability benchmark for Australasia. So we're just using it's called the Trans-Tasman benchmark, which is 50% ASX 200, 50% Trans-Tasman. Get into the detail there around accumulated and portfolio gross. So again, we've proven that you can be this extreme, if you want to call it that, with your ethics and sustainability and impact into a portfolio and still make money. And that's where I contradict myself. But that's still the world we're in. As I said, we're still all on the same ship. So just to round off, what we said earlier, it's not just about what you do, it's how you do it. It's this transformational change, and I think, as I showed you through what we're doing with Treasury, He Ara Wairora model, you can look that up. XRB, the External Reporting Board, they're also grabbing that model. So there are some great examples of how we are getting out of just reformed capitalist type models into something quite a bit different, which is New Zealand Inc. stuff that we can use to be quite a differentiator, not just for this country, but it's something that, if you guys, being the young minds in the space, start to step outside that capitalist model and look at what has to happen from the outside, then you'll be better champions and the transformational leaders that we need to drive this space. So, Forti, Hurirona, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. That's enough talking, but happy to take questions, of course.
We'll take some questions if anyone's got any. That'd be great. I know a few people have promised me some questions, so I hope we get some. And then we'll take our break after. Don't worry, you still get a break before I start talking some more.
No such thing as a dumb question.
Kia ora, I'm Wilder. Do you think that in future business in New Zealand, there'll be reporting on Indigenous impact businesses have on Te Ao Māori? And if so, do you think that this will be measurable?
Yes, so another group I'm involved with is B-Lab. Have you heard of B Corp? Right, so B-Lab is the sort of engine that sits behind B Corp certification, and where I'm on the regional advisory group. And I've had a conversation with them about bringing Indigenous rights as a starting point into that certification. So now you're getting measured against that. A lot of our organisations are bringing in treaty principles. I also sit on there's a Māori advisory group for ASB, and I've been surprised on their uptake in bringing Māori strategies and Māori thinking into their overall strategy, not just a sideline. Most people are running with this treaty policy alongside all their mainstream. Like even that their treasury model is pretty much, it's not an integrated one, but some of them are really integrating the stuff. So yes, but for it to really be taken up, it needs to be regulated. Otherwise people only do, most people will just do enough. They won't, what we're looking for and what we're trying to measure is people that are going to go beyond just doing enough and actually show that leadership as we talk to. But so, hopefully in the future, when you go for a B Corp certification, you have to demonstrate your Indigenous competency and what you're doing to make sure that you're either a positive impact or supporting that. And Aussie have this thing, if you haven't heard already, it's called there's a Aussie model. Sorry, the name just slips my mind. Is anyone familiar with it? Yeah, no, there's a corporate, it's a corporate sort of level of you, and it's addressing Indigenous issues, Indigenous rights, creating Indigenous employment, but there's different layers. So Australia is actually, from a regulated or measured type approach, is ahead of New Zealand. Sorry, that just escapes me what the name of it is. Aboriginal rights, something.
I've kind of got a follow-up question on that. Like in today's businesses use Māori tikanga to kind of, I guess, look like they're doing quite a lot of Māori impact. But do you think that businesses that use Māori tikanga and Māori ideals should have direct impact into the Māori communities or into the communities that they surround if they are going to use Māori tikanga in the first place?
Oh, I mean, my unashamed answer is yes. But what we're seeing happening and what we'll talk about today is really an extension of what you're talking about. Just about all our government departments now, they'll have their porphyries and they've talked about the tangas, Manaaki tanga, Whanaunga tanga, Rangatira tanga, the Kaitiaki tanga. So that's 101 stuff. We need to shift that up. Hence why I thought, geez, I'm just going to throw it out there and show you all of this whakapapa. And so if you're really interested, you start diving into that. But as I said, that's life's work if you really want to get into that stuff. We're at 101 stage. Heartland Bank, go and look up Heartland Bank. They're very good in talking about how they are using these Māori values into driving their business and the decision making. Spark is another one. They've got all these Māori titles and they do all this good stuff. But for people like myself, we got to stay one step ahead of that stuff. We now need to start pushing 102 course using your university level. I don't know, that's what it was when I was sort of at university, first level, second level. We need to start expanding on that understanding. Otherwise, they'll take this word kaitiaki and have it mean something that it's not. See, the beauty of the Māori language is the meaning is actually within the word. You break that word kaitiaki down, kaitiaki tanga. Kai, in this sense, is a person. It's not food, that's another word. Kai refers to the person. Tiaki, ti is to stab, is to poke. Aki is to encourage. So put that together. You're a person that's encouraging. He's a kaitiaki. He's encouraging you fellas. He's educating and encouraging you guys. That's kaitiaki. As soon as you say kaitiaki tanga is looking after the land, you've then used it wrong. But you can have kaitiaki whenua, right? So you've got to put it into a sentence. That's why our value statements aren't one word, because otherwise you're going to misunderstand it. Now, let's take this to another level and see how much you can hang on to. Who knows the Maori word for tree? No? Rako. Okay, the Maori word for tree is rako. So imagine someone steps off a boat, there's a Maori person there, and they're now starting to write down the Maori language, and they go, tree, and this Maori person goes, rako, and they write down rako. And so today, most of our education is that tree means rako and rako means tree. That word rako, break it down, is rakau, which is literally sun that enters. So it's not describing a tree, it's describing the photosynthesis process. So now follow the natural energy transfers. The natural source of energy, the sun, and then nutrients in the earth. Well, as humans, we can't just plant ourselves put our feet into the earth and hold our hands up and get energy. We have to eat the animals and plants. The plants can. So there's your first energy transfer. And then for most plants and animals, we can't eat them raw because we'll get sick. So we have to apply another form of energy and either heat or, whatever the process is, so that we can then consume that energy. When you understand that hierarchy, then you see where humans sit. That's what I mean by humans aren't in the center. And our whakapapa shows us that. So then the leaf is rau. That's the leaf that's actually doing that first job of absorbing sun's energy, which means to capture the sun effectively. And then a forest is called a ngahere, which literally means to capture breath. So this whole understanding that a forest absorbs carbon dioxide and puts out oxygen, already captured in the word. And that's before you get to maunga. Then this one's getting a bit out there for most Māori. Why? Water. Why? Why? Imbued energy. We can't survive without water. So it makes sense that we understood the importance of water to us as humans, and we understood its whakapapa. So that's the Māori worldview when you really want to get lost in this space. So a long answer to a good question. But this is the difference, eh? Flip it or get outside of our humanness and how much can we earn to how good can we be?
Yeah, how do you balance the need to invest in your values and the need to also earn a return? And I'd like you to just want to get your thinking around this from iwi perspective. So like iwi investment managers who are investing on behalf of their iwi, they face this pressure of earning a return enough to give back to the runanga, and then invest in keeping with their values, the Maori values, in a similar framework that you have. So how do you balance those two things?
So, I mean, I'm still involved with a lot of our large iwi and entities and trust and corporations back home in and around Taupo, large forestry trusts, good size too. One of them's at 700 million, the other one's 60 million. I'm involved with CNI, which is 8 iwi, and that's all a Kaingaroa forest, and that forest is valued at over 3 billion. The super fund and the Canadians as the big shareholders in the trees. But just about all the iwi entities, they're on a journey on how I'm bringing in what we call kaupapa-based investing, decision-making into their business. But they're going to vary because a lot of it depends on the depth of the knowledge. Because remember, this isn't what I'm talking about, isn't necessarily known. One thing the colonizers did well is we're the position we're in today, only 1 in 10 Māori actually speak Māori, are connected to their marae, and would have an understanding of this Māori worldview. Probably more than 1 in 10 when it comes to the heartfelt feeling, but then to be able to intellectualize it and then apply it well, then they have to have gone through a different process to be able to get to then be leaders in that space. So it's a transition. And some people will argue, go, well, geez, we weren't, as I showed you those statistics, we weren't the problem in the first place. Why should we have to be the solution when we weren't the polluters? So we'll just go hard the other way. And that's sort of a bit perverse. And I'm not saying that iwi are doing that, because most of them are just on the journey, but where they are on the journey is relative to their knowledge and the change. You know, change management is not easy. That's why they're really sought after. So, you know, that's we're sort of investing in the next generation for you guys to actually make the difference. Our generation's already done the damage for you to fix. But it's a journey, and it varies depending on the knowledge of the leadership and the strength of the leadership. Hence, a lot of emphasis around transformational leadership to make the difference. So it doesn't matter whether you're Maori or not, really. It's just that we can pull off of a system and models that sit outside the capitalist model. And I'm just trying to say, well, look, that's one way of trying to fix the problem, but arguably that could be just shifting the deck chairs on the Titanic. You know, we mightn't do enough fast enough. And hence why these references globally now to indigenous races has maybe been able to unlock that difference. And as I showed you in that, trying to unpack what the financial world looks like. Well, how are we going to change the fact that 1% pretty much controls all of the world's wealth overnight? You know, that doesn't happen quickly unless there's a world war. But what will happen, and geez, hopefully this gets censored, there's a high risk of civil unrest. There's high risk of civil unrest and real globe. When people can't be fed and can't get water and don't feel protected, what happens? Revolution. That's the outcome. Well, firstly, mass migration. And what happens with mass migration? The countries you're moving into, you get all this tension in there. So that's the real risk that we're facing. And that's going to precede climate, the real damage or impact of climate change and biodiversity loss will be the civil unrest if we don't address the equity issue. Man, I'd love to sit in a room and debate that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, lucky we got the rest of the afternoon to catch up. Thank you so much, Tim. I personally enjoyed the presentation a lot. I hope the people online enjoyed it. Sorry we didn't get to any of your questions. And students will take a few-minute break, and then I'll get into the rest of the impact investing topic. Yeah. Cool. Cheers, guys. Please help me thank Tim.
And just remember, I'm still trying to run a business, so I'm inside that world. I'm still trying to get investors into the fund. So, you know, again, I'm still a deck chair on that Titanic, but with a lifeboat.